Re-releases and special editions of albums are pretty common. It's a way of reselling a favorite album while giving something new and interesting to the fans. You can have remasters, bonus tracks, or even a full remix of the original album to show a brand new side of the original. Sometimes they're a blessing, sometimes less so, but they all provide something interesting, something worthy of scrutiny. My name is Michael, and across this series we will be looking at various remixes of famous albums and how they shed new light on their source material and even improve on it, or fail to live up to its expectations. This is It's the Remix. Hello all, and welcome to another episode of It's the Remix. Today we'll be discussing Nirvana's sophomore album Nevermind and the two studio mixes that exist of this landmark album. Now, to be completely honest, I might be cheating a little bit here because strictly speaking, the mix of the album the world at large is familiar with is the remix. Some context. Nevermind was recorded by Nirvana across May and June of 1991. The production was supervised by renowned producer Butch Vig. By the end of these sessions, the band had an initial mix in their hands, but they and Vig weren't completely happy with this mix. To remedy the situation, they reached out looking for someone else to take over the mixing proceedings, landing on producer Andy Wallace. Wallace vastly overhauled the guitars and drums on the album, making it into something more radio-friendly. This was the version of the album that was released in 1991 to massive critical acclaim. However, while Vig and Wallace maintained that the band was happy with this mix, almost immediately on release they seemed to walk this back, stating a preference for Vig's original mixes. This was a sentiment echoed by producer Steve Albini, who would use Vig's initial mixes as a guide for his productions for the band's final album In Utero. This original mix would go unheard by the general public until 2011, when it was released on a 20th anniversary Super Deluxe set. So the question remains, which mix works better? Vig's original mix or Wallace's substantial rework? Now, I might be going against the grain here a little bit, but I vastly prefer Wallace's mix. Now, sometimes there's not a lot of difference between the mixes. Some effects notwithstanding, Breed is largely the same on both Vig's and Wallace's mixes for this album. Poly isn't represented at all on Vig's mixes, which leads me to believe that Wallace just ended up using Vig's initial mix on the final album as well. But the rest of the time, there is a very noticeable difference between the two producers' approach with this album, and Vig's approach leaves me kinda underwhelmed. See, the trouble is that the two mixes are trying to do completely different things. Vig's initial mix is pretty bare bones, mostly just the guitar, bass, drum setup. It sounds like a one-to-one recording of Nirvana playing the tracks live, so to speak. And this does make for an interesting listen a lot of the time. There's a lot more guitar feedback on Vig's initial mix, which is pretty fun in some ways. But there's something missing from this mix. For lack of better words, it's nowhere near as punchy as Wallace's rework. There are several factors at play here. For example, the vocals. In Vig's initial mix, Kurt Cobain's voice is frequently pretty low set in the mix, making him hard to make out a lot of the time. This is especially the case on Smells Like Teen Spirit. In the chorus, Kurt's voice all but vanishes. By comparison, on Wallace's remix, they remain at the same level of clarity throughout. Now, this isn't to say that the vocals on Vig's mix are bad. In fact, there are occasions where I prefer their treatment to Wallace's remix. For example, on Come As You Are. I'll be buggered if I know the words for the effects on the vocal track here, but they certainly make Kurt sound a lot more cooler than on Wallace's mix. Come as you are, as you were, as I want you to be. There's a subtle delay on the vocal track on Territorial Pissings that I quite like on Vig's mix, but the trouble is, once the guitars come in full force, he's buried. Also, for some reason, Vig chose to bury Kurt's cathartic scream at the end of the interlude of Drain You, a choice I do not understand. Wallace did well to bring that out into the foreground as it provides a necessary release before launching into the last chorus. Another major point against Vig's mixes to me is the almost total lack of double tracking. A quick explanation of double tracking for those who may not know. In rock music, it is common practice to record a guitar part twice, playing them as close to identical as possible, then push those takes all the way to the left and right speakers, just because it turns around on the camera. It gives the guitar a lot more punch and also opens up the stereo image nicely.
This is a reminder.
As an example, here's the intro of In Bloom from Wallace's mix. The guitar here is double tracked, giving the opening a nice punch. However, on Vig's initial mixes, this technique is all but absent. The guitars are largely single-tracked and for some reason frequently pushed towards the left channel. The result is that the album loses a lot of that punch and sounds almost unfinished. There are exceptions to this on occasion, like on both the Vig and Wallace mix, Drain You has something like 5 guitar layers playing the same thing. But overall, the lack of double tracking definitely hurts this mix. I understand the appeal of a more raw sounding mix of this album, but even on In Utero, the much rawer follow-up to this album, Steve Albini double tracked the guitars for the most part. It'll always just make the album sound a lot better to do that. Now, I could go through this album track by track and make a laundry list of changes like this, but as the changes are much the same from track to track in general, there wouldn't be much point. Instead, I'm going to focus on one track, one that I think best sums up my general points with this record. Lounge Act. This is my favorite song on Nevermind. It is to me one of Nirvana's more underrated cuts. It is also the perfect example of what Vig and Wallace's respective intentions were when mixing this album, and how they compare in execution. On Vig's initial mix, it's a lot more literal to what was played, just guitar, bass, drums. On Vig's mix, you can hear exactly how the dynamics of the song are played out. On the verses, Kurt's guitar is being passed through an amp with what sounds to me like a bit of overdrive on it. Look, I'm not a guitar sound expert, so you're gonna have to bear with me here. But for the choruses and the final verse, he steps on a distortion pedal to give the song a little extra momentum. Now in concept, this works perfectly. I imagine that when played live, this sounds fucking awesome. Actually, I don't have to imagine, there are live recordings out there that demonstrate this rather nicely. But the trouble is that Vig's mix doesn't quite capture the punch that distortion pedal adds to the song. I don't know if it comes down to the volume the guitar's sitting at in the mix, or the fact that it sounds like it's only single-tracked, but there's something missing. Enter Wallace. On his mix, Wallace single-tracks the guitar with just the overdrive, placing it at the center. Then, for the first two choruses, another guitar enters on the right, playing with a distortion pedal. Then, for the final verse and chorus, this distorted guitar is double-tracked, pushing the track forward with even more momentum so it races towards the finish line. This isn't a literal one-to-one of what was recorded, but it far better translates the intensity of the song to me. It also allows for some artistic license. The distorted guitar on the right signals its entry with a crunch, one that gives those choruses a little extra kick. At the end of the day, I will always go with Wallace's mix of the album. It has a lot more punch to it, and it also sounds a lot more finished than Vig's mix does. It's the much better album, so that leaves me with the question, why did Nirvana switch up on it, and why do a lot of people seem to prefer Vig's mix? The impression I get is that it comes down to the more live sound of Vig's mix. It does sound a little bit more punk rock, like three guys just playing the music. And there's nothing wrong with preferring that sound, I totally respect it. But for me personally, the punch of Wallace's mix is necessary to making this album stand out. And then there's the fact that it sounds more commercial than most of Nirvana's other work. See, here's the thing. I don't consider radio-friendly a swear word. Being accessible to a wider audience is not inherently a terrible thing. Yes, Wallace's remix of Nevermind sounds easier to market to a wider audience, but at no point does it compromise Nirvana's edge in the process. Breed still sounds pretty aggressive, and the extra overdubs on Lounge Act make it infinitely punchier. But yeah, at the end of the day, I will always prefer the Wallace mix, the one that was initially released in 1991. But again, it's all down to personal preference, so if you prefer Vig's mix, go for it. I can't end like that. That's all for today. I hope you all have a good day, and I'll be back with another album soon. Cheesy dead.